Today's topic is a fascinating one, I believe. I've never spoken on this topic before, and I'm going to be building on the discussion of Josephus that we began last week. Those of you who watch these lectures on the internet, you may find some of the slides similar because I've built on an earlier presentation on the topic. But we're going to be looking at a work written by a non-Jew named APION, whose oeuvre does not survive, but nevertheless he had a very profound impact on the work of one Roman Jewish historian, Flavius Josephus, and as a result of the response to Apion's work, we have a tremendous insight into exactly how Jews were considered in the Roman Empire, or at least some sense of it. So who was Apion? He's a figure who lived in Alexandria, which was part of Hellenized Egypt at the turn of the millennium. He was a grammarian, and he wrote some belles lettres and various types of public pronouncements. None of his works survive, although they are cited in quite a few ancient documents. Perhaps the best well-known of his parables is that of Androcles and the lion, the famous story, I'm sure you've heard it probably in a children's sort of tale, of a man who goes into a cave, a runaway slave, and he hides in the cave and he finds a ferocious lion there, and he discovers that the lion is troubled by a thorn in his paw. So Androcles removes the thorn from the paw of the lion. The lion is then forever grateful to Androcles. Later they show up in Rome, and there's all kinds of stories surrounding their encounter, and he becomes famous as a result of his association with this lion. So that's the most famous story told by Apion that resonates to the present day. We also know that Apion wrote quite a bunch of nasty things about Jews, and so much so that the great Jewish historian Flavius Josephus decided to write a book directed to those charges made by Apion. It's called Contra Apion, Against Apion. That's a Canadian pronunciation. I think for those of you in America, you would say Against Apion. And it's basically a refutation of his various charges. We don't have the original. We only have the response, but from the response we can understand something of the original, mitoch alav ata shomea hein, as they would say in the Talmud. So that's going to be our discussion today, is basically understanding a little bit about the milieu of first century Rome and first century Jews in the larger Roman Empire, specifically within the context of anti-Semitic thought, and what that says about Josephus as well as an individual. It was not at all unusual for someone to dabble in primitive science and literature and grammar, and all of these disciplines sort of melded together. If you were a public intellectual, you had something to say about just about everything. And Apion was apparently one of these individuals. Not a great literary figure, and certainly not a star historian like Herodotus or anyone like that, but he did play some role, he did publish something, and he was cited in a number of other ancient writers who have survived to the present day. Okay, but he was obviously not valuable enough that anyone would keep his work specifically. Second-rate intellectual, as it were. Maybe third-rate. Anyways, the site of much of our discussion is in Alexandria, shown here on the northern coast of Egypt. It's named, of course, after Alexander, who we discussed quite a bit last week. Beautiful-looking part of the world. It actually had a very large ancient Jewish community that is quite fascinating in its own right. It's a community that goes back before the destruction of the second temple, perhaps even as far back as the destruction of the first temple. And the most famous Denzian of the region in the Jewish community was this individual, Philon, also known as Philo, a Jewish philosopher who attempted to bridge the gap between Hellenistic culture and Jewish culture, and wrote quite a bit of useful material in Greek explaining Judaism to the wider Hellenistic audience. For various reasons, he was not picked up in the rabbinic tradition. There are certain things he has to say about Judaism that did not sit well with the rabbis of Israel, and as a result, he's kind of like bifurcated bifurcated from the main thrust of Jewish intellectual traditions, but he is nevertheless extremely important in the Christian understanding of Judaism, primarily because Philon wrote in Greek, a language that was accessible to the Church Fathers, and most of what they thought about Judaism was based on Philon's interpretation thereof. Very important figure whose work has lasted to the present day, and gives you an interesting sort of glimpse into a somewhat non-halachic approach to Judaism that was quite popular in Alexandria at the time. At any rate, let's look at our protagonist, as it were, is actually Josephus. And as we mentioned last week, Josephus is, of course, the great historian of the Roman period. He was, his real name is Yosef ben Matityahu. He was given the name Titus Flavius after the Roman emperors who actually destroyed Rome, and a Roman general as well. His years are approximately 37 to 100, and he is most well known for his book on the destruction of the city of Jerusalem in the context of the first century war with the Romans. He's also known for his great work, Jewish Antiquities, which is, again, a Greek language account of Jewish history from the beginning of time up until the Roman era, and he was perhaps even more important than Philon as being the person who transmitted Jewish culture to the Hellenistic world as a whole. I have a whole lecture on Josephus. Here's a little YouTube link, so if you want to know more about him specifically, you can certainly watch it on the internet. But we'll just look at a couple of key elements in his life to put his comments on APION in context. This is a sort of a 19th century Christian depiction of what they thought Flavius Josephus must have looked like. Josephus is also, like Philon, extremely popular in the Christian canon, primarily because he wrote in Greek, a language accessible to the Church Fathers, and also he had some interesting kind of comments, which he may not have been the author of these comments, but there are passages referring to the founder of the Christian faith in his books that obviously elicited a lot of interest from its readers. What we know, what he says about himself, actually one of his final works is his autobiography, and he wrote quite a bit of autobiographical material in a lot of his other works. He was a Kohen, a member of the priestly family. He claimed an extremely strong Jewish education. He says with not a drop of humility how at age 14 he stumped all the rabbis and he knew more than everyone else. He apparently came from a Pharisaic tradition, which would be similar to the rabbinic tradition that essentially are the good guys of Jewish history, the forerunners of contemporary Jewish movements, as distinct from, let's say, the Sadducees, who were involved with the temple cult, or the Essenes, or the Zealots. He came from pretty much mainstream Jewish thought and Jewish background. There's some debate over exactly where he situates himself. He claims with some degree of authenticity to be an expert on everything Jewish, but there's quite a number of glaring mistakes in his descriptions of Jewish traditions, which either indicates a lack of knowledge, or it could indicate a certain amount of dissimulation before a Roman readership. He wrote in two principal languages, in Greek for his non-Jewish audience, and also in Aramaic for his Jewish audience. These are translations of one another. The Aramaic texts are unfortunately lost, so we don't know what he was saying when he was speaking to Jews as opposed to what he was saying when he was speaking to the outside world. But he is kind of like a cultural communicator, or actually I think the term now is a culture broker. He was brokering Jewish culture to the larger Hellenistic world, and he was one of the primary vehicles of giving Romans an understanding of what it is about these strange people that they're constantly fighting with. I hope the zooming doesn't disturb you too much. This is a coin minted by Vespasian, one of the most important figures in the Roman Empire at the time of the destruction of the the temple. His greatest work is in the last decades of the Hashmonaim dynasty that we spoke about last week, and the beginnings of the Roman domination, that of course culminating in the destruction of the temple, the conquest of Masada, so many other things. I think I was just learning how to use Prezi when I made this slide, so it tended to have all of this kind of nauseating spinning around. I apologize. At any rate, as a youth he traveled to Rome, and it made a huge impression on him. I mean, unlike Jerusalem, which was a spiritual vortex to be sure, but unlike the tiny buildings of Jerusalem, the tiny population, the quasi-rural nature of this biblical capital, Rome was already a massive city with huge buildings made of concrete, huge, monumental architecture that the Romans were so famous for, paved roads, all kinds of things like that. He was really overwhelmed, and he was quite taken with Roman culture. And you can see that he became somewhat apologetic towards the Romans, and one might suspect that this had a large role in his later decision to join the Romans in the context of the wars, which was a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. It occurred with the fall of Yodfat, where he was apparently a commander. He describes all this, by the way, in his books. And so it's his own description of exactly how he came to become a Roman citizen. He was, the Jewish forces, of which he was in command of one battalion, were surrounded. They devised a suicide pact similar to that occurred later in Masada in 73. And the decision was that after they drew straws, Josephus would be the last person to kill himself. And then, of course, when it was his turn, he changed his mind and he said, oh, you know what? Better I should join the Romans. Better a live dog than a dead lion, something like that. And he ended up being captured by Vespasian, the general, later emperor, who was in charge of Rome. At that point, he entered Roman captivity. This is a picture of Vespasian himself, and he served essentially as an informer to the Romans. He understood the Aramaic language, which was the lingua franca of the Jews. He understood the territory, he understood the political environment, he understood the players, and so he was an invaluable military aide-de-camp to the Romans in their prosecution of the war against the Jews. And as a result, he definitely played a traitorous role in this context, which placed him in an awkward position, kind of a liminal position for the rest of his life, because he earned his credentials by betraying his people, and then he spent the rest of his career, his literary career, defending his people to the culture that he had attached himself to. In some ways a rather tragic figure. Not nearly as tragic as all the Jews who were killed by the Romans as a result of his activity, but nevertheless a tragic figure. And he witnessed most likely firsthand the destruction of the temple itself, which he describes, and of course historians are deeply indebted to his treatment of the siege and fall of Jerusalem. Moving to Rome, he is commissioned to write a history of the wars, which, of course, he writes. We have, again, only the Greek version, so we have only the authorized version that the emperors would approve of. This is Titus, the son of Vespasian, who was responsible for destroying Jerusalem itself. As a result of producing this literary account of the battle, he gets the honorific title Flavius, after the family of the Roman empires, and the book receives rave reviews from the people that count, and it's placed in the Roman equivalent of the Library of Congress, the Imperial Library. Josephus went on to lead a life of leisure, although it was certainly without personal pleasure. He was married 3 times, deserted by one of his wives, divorced another wife, generally speaking had very difficult times developing a significant communal relationship. And we know that he nevertheless enjoyed quite a degree of literary success, because he produced work after work of these multi-volume, massive tomes that apparently had a readership because the Romans were quite fascinated with the Jews. Even despite the fact that they engaged in multiple wars with the Jews and ultimately took over the country in a very brutal way, Romans were fascinated with Jews, very high degree of conversion to Judaism. Within the marketplace of ideas, Judaism was a highly attractive ideology, competed very well with all of the other ideologies that were circulating at the time, and Josephus was the go-to guy. He was, so to speak, the Oprah of Judaism of the ancient world. Is that the right metaphor? I don't know. Josephus is the Oprah. It appeals to me somehow. But he's kind of like the Deepak Chopra, maybe, of... I think I'll probably edit that section out of the internet part of this video. But at any rate, he continued to publish in all of this time. Okay, I think this is a good point to pause. Oh, well, no, I'll say one more thing here. One of his more important post-war books, again, he wrote the history of the Roman-Jewish wars, then he wrote this book called Jewish Antiquities. The title Antiquity is actually very significant, as we shall see later on tonight, which is this huge multi-volume history of the world with emphasis on the history of the Jewish people. So it's essentially Tanakh sort of rehashed, and he goes through the Genesis all the way through the Egyptian bondage, and then the Exodus to Israel, and the period of the judges and the periods of the kings and so on. And he gave the Romans essentially a compact version of the histories described in the Hebrew scriptures. He tends to be at his strongest literary style when he is plagiarizing. When he is making things up, he tends to be very inaccurate and self-contradictory, but nevertheless a widely read book that continues to exist in the contemporary period. Perhaps the most famous edition today is the great Loeb's Classics Library, which offers it in bilingual Greek and Hebrew, Greek and English, I'm sorry, very popular. As I mentioned, he has a fairly weak grasp of Rabbinic Judaism despite his claims at erudition, but he was the #1 person to ask about Judaism in the Roman world to the end of the 1st century. Okay, now I think I should probably pause right now because we have to talk about APION. So let me take a couple of questions. One of the last books that Josephus wrote was called Against APION. One of his best works in many ways. It has fairly high literary quality. There are, clever parts that you can read 2,000 years later and still laugh. There's persuasive argument, and it really is, from my limited reading of Josephus, definitely one of his best works. And basically, he is taking a time to say, listen, I would never want to bother with these kinds of things, but it seems like there are these scurrilous individuals like this APION character who keeps on saying nasty things about the Jewish people. And since, remember, he's the Deepak Chopra of the Jewish world at that time, he's saying, I really have to respond. I have to speak up on behalf of my people and let you know that APION has it all wrong. Now, again, because Josephus is somewhat liminal in his own relationship to the Jewish people and the Roman world, he occupies that kind of borderland between those two cultures. You read between the lines a certain amount of his own reflection on the choices he's made in his own life, joining the Romans, joining Roman culture, living in Rome. You feel the sense of tristesse that he has, the sense of loss, the level of sadness he has, because he's not of the community anymore. He can talk about the community, but he's ultimately an outsider to the community. Famous, but nevertheless an outsider. But he does his best to represent Jews and Judaism well in this very polemical context. And when we look at his responses to APION, we get to the core of a very nasty debate among historians as to the origins of anti-Semitism. When did anti-Semitism start? Who's responsible for the beginning of this very noxious intellectual movement that has wreaked such havoc on the Jewish people? So let's look at some of those charges. Let's understand, first of all, please have a look at this piece of monumental architecture. I'm sure you've seen it in many contexts. This is the Arch of Titus in Rome. It celebrates the victory of Roman forces over Jerusalem. And when you zoom in, if you walk underneath it, which I have heard, I'm not sure if it's true, that Roman Jews refuse to walk underneath this particular statue. Yes, you're going to see it here. I'm going to give you a nice good look at it. You can see here we are looking like straight up at the arch from the bottom, and on the right-hand side here, you can see there is quite a large bas-relief. Looks like it's about 10-12 feet high, and if we back up and look at the whole thing, you can see that it depicts the Jews being led off into captivity. This is an arch that celebrates the destruction of Jerusalem from the Roman point of view. The Jews are enslaved, and of course they have the menorah here, which is, you know, an element of some controversy, because according to Jewish tradition, the Romans did not capture the menorah. Nevertheless, Titus portrays it as if it was captured. This is like perhaps the most important symbol of Judaism for most of Jewish iconographic history. Let me ask you a question about this, open to the audience. Is this an anti-Semitic depiction? Can we characterize this as one of the most important ancient representations of anti-Semitic thought? No. Why not? You know, you can probably tell from my tone of voice I want a no answer. Why not? You look at most textbooks and they'll say, look, oh, those Romans, look at how anti-Semitic they are. Because it's, you know, this is art depicting a military victory. If we walk around New York City, we will find lots of examples of this. Any city in the world, you will find depictions of military victories in which we're the good guys, they're the bad guys, and we won. So we don't like it because we lost, and we're portrayed here in a demeaning manner, but it does not mean that it is anti-Semitic per se. We'll have to identify what anti-Semitism is, but let's look at periods of anti-Semitic history. So historians generally divide the ideological history of anti-Semitism to 4 distinct periods. The first period, which we are going to discuss at some length today, is ancient xenophobia, which, as you can tell from the word, is essentially a prejudice directed against the other, against strangers. Xenos in Greek means foreigner. So the fear of the stranger, the distrust of the stranger, that's what characterizes generally the ancient period. I will quickly look at the other 3 periods, and we will, God willing, have an opportunity to discuss them in later lectures, but just to put it in context, the second major period is known as the period of early Christian anti-Judaism. And this period is rather distinct primarily because whereas in the ancient world the Romans or the Greeks had an antipathy to Jews as the other, when you get to the early Christian period, and by this I'm talking about basically from the 1st century to the 9th century, we're talking about the unique dynamic that occurs with the birth of a daughter religion. Since Christianity has a special relationship to the mother religion, it has a special type of antipathy as well. We could spend a lot of time talking about this, but it's kind of like if you imagine a daughter who rejects the ancient family recipe. For a long time, the daughter is going to be feeling just a tiny bit of insecurity that maybe the ancient family recipe is really better, and I'm trying to force the issue by saying my recipe is better. And she will always have that kind of nagging doubt about it. And one of the ways to deal with that nagging doubt psychologically is not only to promote her new recipe, but to deride the traditional recipe. I usually spend about 5 minutes explaining this in other classes, but I don't want to spend that much time now. And this is what the rather heroic Protestant theologian Rosemary Radford Ruther called the anti-Semitism is the left hand of Christology. Meaning that if the right hand is elevating Christianity, the left hand at the same time would be deriding Judaism. It's part of the same balance. In promoting the daughter, one needs reject the mother. And that's something you can't say about Greeks or Romans because they don't have the same relationship with Judaism as Christianity would. This is a reproduction of a monumental architecture outside the city of Strasbourg. The originals are both about 12 feet tall on the outside of a cathedral. They're known to art historians as the Strasbourg Sisters. And it is a representation of something we have literally hundreds upon hundreds of examples of it. This figure on the right-hand side, your left-hand side, represents the church, and the figure on the left-hand side, your right-hand side, represents the synagogue. There are always very similar motifs in how they're portrayed. The church is upright, her bodice is done up properly, her staff is intact, she's holding the Holy Grail, she's crowned, she's looking forward, her eyes are open. The synagogue, on the other hand, these are all like symbols of power and symbols of authority. Whereas over here, the synagogue, her staff is broken, her crown is missing, sometimes it's depicted as falling. She's holding on to the tablets of the law, but she's holding them in a form that shows that she's losing them, they're falling out of her hand. She's blindfolded, and her posture, she's literally falling away from the rock. She is in a position of decline. And the church kind of looks daggers at her. And the whole message, which would be especially important when this is portrayed to an illiterate peasant audience, is that, the synagogue, the Jews, used to be the favored people, and now the church is regnant. And you can depict this with 100 little details shown in the image. So this is a special type of antipathy to Jews, which is primarily theological in nature. It's primarily a debate between rabbis and priests. It does not have the xenophobic character that you saw in the ancient period, but it will also not have the really nasty character of the next period, which is medieval Jew hatred. And this period begins really in the 13th century, and explodes with the Gutenberg Revolution, with the availability of cheap media, with the printing press. And this is when things just go off the rails. The belief that Jews need to kill Christian children and drink their blood, as is shown here in the depiction of the supposed martyrdom of Simon of Trent, the idea that Jews are in league with the devil, black Sabbaths, and all kinds of witchcraft, things like that are completely pathological, no longer similar to the more calm and sedate debate that we saw in the earlier period. This is something you see in the medieval period, and it really gets quite nasty. The final period, which is the period which we continue to enjoy to the present day, that of modern anti-Semitism, which has basically two central ideas. There will be borrowings from earlier types of anti-Semitism, but the two basic ideas are, one is racism, the idea that the Jews constitute a race, distinct from religious ideology, distinct from political leanings. It's a racial concept. And secondly, that Jews are engaged in a worldwide conspiracy. As you see in this Nazi depiction, das jüdische Komplett, the Jewish conspiracy, a very characterized form of a Jew with the kind of satirical nose and heavy jowls and things like that. And under here showing all of the links between Roosevelt and Stalin and Churchill and so on. And this is the idea that we have in the modern period. We still, unfortunately, have this ideology today. It's quite distinct from the earlier period, primarily because it's detached completely from its religious moorings. Religion is largely irrelevant to modern anti-Semitism because race and conspiracy don't rely on earlier religious themes, but quite distinct from the other earlier periods. So those are basically the four periods of anti-Semitic thought. Any arguments or discussions or objections? Clear as the sun at noonday. Okay, so let's look at the ancient period and look at Apion's charges in particular to understand more about the kinds of things that Josephus chose to respond to. So the first charge that Josephus deals with against Apion is Apion's charge that the Jews are impious. Now, why would you think that the Jews would be considered impious, non-religious, atheistic, literally? Please.
Bow down to
because they would not do the simple religious act of bowing down to idols. I mean, just sacrifice a pig already. Remember what happened in the Hashmonaim period, right? Matisyahu, he started a whole war over, can't you just sacrifice a little pig? It doesn't have to be a big one. They refused entirely to participate in public religion. And this was considered the height of impiety. Can you give me a clue as to why I chose this example to illustrate impiety? It's kind of a lateral way of thinking, sort of twisted. What's popular religion today? What would be an example of being considered impious today?
Star-Spangled Banner.
Ah, very good.
Take your hat off.
Exactly. When you go to a ball game and someone starts singing the Star Spangled Banner, if you don't stand up, take off your hat, put your hand on your heart, and sing along, wow, you're like a communist or something, right? That would be like refusing to participate in the secular culture, the secular myth, as it were, the secular religion. And the Jews were like so over the top with this, completely refusing to participate in any of the sacrificial activities of the Romans. And we can go even further. APION says these Jews are ridiculous. They claim to worship a God that you cannot see. Have you ever heard of anything so ridiculous? A God that you cannot see. Josephus actually takes them down here on a logical point because, of course, by this time, we're talking about the 1st century, Plato, Aristotle is well known, and they generally also believed in an invisible God, and they generally took the plastic representations of the Godhead with a grain of salt, but you know, Josephus can't have it both ways. Either the Jews don't worship a physical God, or they do worship a physical God, but you can't have it both ways. APION also charged, I should have mentioned, that when Antiochus Epiphanes, remember the king we talked about last week, when he entered into the temple, APION charged that he actually found inside the Kodesh Kadoshim, the Holy of Holies, a golden donkey's head. And that was like the actual God of the Jews. And Josephus just says, this is ridiculous. You know, one way or the other. Either we don't worship, you know, statues, or we do worship statues. You can't argue both at the same time. So the Jews are impious. That was one of the big charges in APION's work. Another charge, that the Jews were deceitful. And perhaps the classic example that APION brings is that the Jews lied about the whole story of the Exodus. That was all made up. APION says, you know what actually happened? The Jews suffered. So can you believe it? I'm halfway into that lecture and I'm really enjoying it. I think it's going well. I've got a good rapport with the audience and things are really happening. And then the batteries on the wireless microphone went kaput. So that was it. I keep speaking for another half hour, but the lecture doesn't have any sound, so it just has me talking and talking. So I can still save it. I can sort of import this added video over the slides so that you can at least get a sense of what happened for the second exciting half of that lecture. So let's go straight back to the material, and I'll try and make this as quick and as efficient as possible. Another thing that, so why were we deceitful? So just to pick it up, APION says that the argument is that we didn't actually escape Egypt, you know, with great fanfare and victories. We were driven out of Egypt because we were lepers and things like that. That's Manetho's thesis, and of course that's very appealing to Egyptians, and APION certainly enjoys that. He also says, incidentally, that we are quite slothful, that the Jews are very lazy. Why? Because they take off 1 day in 7. The Sabbath, of course. They rest, refuse to do any work on 1 day in 7, which he indicates is a form of sloth, of laziness. And at the same time, he has an interesting kind of derivation for the word Shabbat. He says that it derives from an Egyptian word for groin injury. He says that as the Jews were traveling through the desert, it was such a long march that they received a terrible groin injury that made it difficult for them to go on. I think the word for that, if I remember correctly in Josephus, was Saba. And so therefore they took that day off until they could heal, and they call that day Shabbat. And of course this is all quite absurd, and Josephus goes to town with APION disproving that. But nevertheless, one of the major charges that you find in APION's work is the idea that Jews are deceitful. He also, related to that, argues that Jews are hypocritical, that they engage in many of the things that they say which are forbidden to them, which, you know, like human beings do these kinds of things. It's very difficult to be consistent. As the Vilna Gaon once said, Hergel al kol davar shilton, that consistency has power over everything. That's actually a quote from Rabbeinu Yonah. It also occurs in the Tanya as well. Hergel al kol davar shilton, but I'm getting off track. APION argues that the Jews are hypocritical, that they actually love pork, for example, when they say they hate pork, and many other examples such as that. He also says, and this encompasses a large body of arguments that the Jews are misanthropic, meaning that they hate other human beings. From the Greek word miseo, means to hate, and anthropos, meaning human being. And he sees this in a whole slew of specific behaviors. For example, the refusal of Jews to eat non-kosher food, which I know earlier we said was hypocritical, but it doesn't have to make sense. It just has to make an argument. That their refusal to consume non-Jewish food, non-kosher food, makes it difficult for Jews and non-Jews to socialize. That's an example of misanthropy, and so on. Never mind the fact that non-Jews can, of course, eat at Jewish tables, but Jews who observe the dietary regulations cannot eat at non-Jewish tables. Similarly, and on a very important level, the idea of circumcision is bothersome to APION, because he holds that it indicates a kind of clannishness, that the Jews are refusing to admit anyone into their number unless they are in fact circumcised. That is obviously referring to the males. And this is true. Circumcision is a really important marker of Jewish identity. There are exceptions to the rule which are kind of interesting, but not for this particular talk. But he says this is an example of clannishness, of misanthropy that's characteristic of the Jews. And finally, he argues that Jews are seditious, meaning that they are traitorous, that they want to rebel against their host nation. This is, of course, a charge that has gone on through the centuries, the charge of dual loyalty, that the Jews would somehow be more loyal to Israel or their homeland or their people than they would to their adopted country. You see here in this example the depiction of Dreyfus, Alfred Dreyfus, the famous French Jewish captain in the French army at the turn of the 20th century, who was framed for espionage when in fact he was not at all guilty of the charge, but nevertheless it released a tremendous outpouring of anti-Semitism in early French society, early 20th century society. Not for our discussion today, but obviously an extremely important example of that charge of dual loyalty. So these are the kinds of things that APION brings to the table. One after another, he charges the Jews with all kinds of these nasty topics. Now, in this particular slide, I chose to include a photograph of my father, Oliver Shalom, because he always used to say this phrase in French, plus ça change, plus c'est la même chose. The more it changes, the more it stays the same. And in many ways, APION's charges are pretty standard. I mean, you can see those throughout the history of anti-Semitism, misanthropy and clannishness, deceitful and so on. Drag any anti-Semite out of the intellectual woodwork of the last few millennium and you'll find various iterations of these charges. Or could you say that no, APION is something distinct, something different from most later anti-Semitism, primarily because APION lacks the special animus that we see with the advent of Western traditions in particular. The unique separation of church and synagogue, for example, puts a different spin on these things that APION did not participate in at all. This is something that you'll see in the scholarly debate on the question of the origins of anti-Semitism. A little bit too broad, perhaps, for our purposes today. Josephus brilliantly comes to the defense of the Jewish people, and I have to say it was really good reading, especially because I've read a lot of Josephus in the past, and this was something I hadn't read before, and it was really quite special to see him in this vein. I'll return to that in a second. But meanwhile, there are four main arguments that Josephus marshals to counteract the arguments of APION. First of all, he says Judaism is really old. And we saw that earlier with his book, the title of which is Jewish Antiquities. It's important to note that in the ancient world, antiquity was very much respected. The idea that something was very old meant that it had withstood the test of time, that it had the kind of staying power because it was ipso facto valid. The fact that it was old meant that it must be good. And Josephus simply lays APION out on this argument, saying, Judaism was around long before the Greeks, long before the Scythians, Parthians, and so on, you name it. So Judaism has a lot to offer. Secondly, he argues that Judaism is fundamentally rational. he argues that the law, the Torah in other words, makes a lot of sense, and that you can explain the law. It's not capricious, and it's not arbitrary like you see with the way the Greek gods behave, for example. The Jewish God has a purpose and a method and an argument, and he lays out rules in advance, and he spells out consequences for violations of those rules and so on. So the law as a whole makes a lot of sense. Very powerful argument against APION. Third big argument is he says that look how the Jews absorb the law and make it popular. Unlike the various beliefs in the Greek gods, for example, one could easily transgress against a given Greek god and suddenly be punished for it and have no idea in advance that in fact this particular action would tick off that god. Judaism, on the other hand, makes this popular and in the sense that it makes it available to all. Josephus spends a lot of time talking about how, common Jews, even women and children, he underlines that point, even women and children know the law as well as they know their own last names. Very, and in fact there is a lot to say for this. In Josephus's time, actually a little bit earlier, Jews actually established the first public school system ever. Public system of education for the masses. We don't know too much about its effectiveness, and it was short-lived because of internal political turmoil, but nevertheless the idea, the commitment to public mass education is something that is really quite extraordinary in the ancient world. And finally, he points to the unusual level of dedication to the law that is evinced by his fellow Jews. The idea that the law is something beloved and cherished to Jews, and that they will defend the Torah to the utmost. Even the most common, simple Jew would give their lives for a single halacha, a single letter of the law. Taking all of these things together, Josephus makes a case against APION that ultimately his charges are poorly developed, poorly argued, and ultimately unsustainable. So to reflect on against APION as a text, what I found most fascinating about it was that, here's Josephus, who is a problematic character when you think about Jewish historiography. I mean, after all, he went over to the Roman side. We don't know precisely the contours of that relationship. We know only from his own rather self-serving account how he came to be in Vespasian's employ and how he was involved in the destruction of the temple and many other things that represented a fundamental betrayal of his people. And the rest of his life was lived in some luxury in the Roman capital, where he was feted as a great author. All of his works received tremendous sponsorship, and he was regarded as a scholar of first rank in his day. And at the same time, here he is writing, defending the Jews whom he has betrayed in his own lifetime. We don't know how he spoke to other Jews. We don't have his Aramaic originals of these books. One wonders if he even wrote an Aramaic original of this against APION. And we don't know what kind of tone and what kind of arguments he would put forth to explain his own behavior. But in this particular book, against APION, we see him struggling with his own personal background, his own personal history, and there's clearly an element of tristesse there, a kind of a sadness, a kind of a nostalgia for his days before the Roman invasion. That really becomes apparent, and you get to know Josephus more as a person and more as a kind of a pathetic character, caught to some degree in the twisting turns of fate, and but nevertheless striving to defend his Jewish background and identity in a very meaningful way. It also provides, against APION, provides a very useful starting point to understand what anti-Semitism looked like in the ancient world, and on a scholarly level to measure it against later developments in the history of this noxious ideology. Okay, that's about it for the lecture. I really apologize that you weren't able to hear the audio of the regular part of it, but I'm very grateful that I was able to make it up this way, and I hope you'll come and attend in person. Thank you very much for watching.
Stand clear of the closing doors, please.